Hi there, I'm Julie Busteed with the Christian Working Woman, and today we're talking about what really matters. And as Christ followers, it matters how we think about our work. And so when you hear the word work, what do you think of? Do you think of drudgery and frustration and something you have to do to pay the bills? Or does it bring up feelings of creativity, and are you challenged and satisfied by your work? If you're like most people, it's kind of a combination of both things, right? So, have you thought about where the word work shows up in the Bible first? And you might think it might be Genesis 1, where it's the creation story, or Genesis 3 after the fall, but actually it's in Genesis 2 before the fall. And in Hebrew, there are two different words for work that are translated into work. The first one is in Genesis 2. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing, so on the seventh day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So this shows that work is something that God does. And if God is only good and can only do good, that means that work is good. To see how God works, we go back to Genesis 1 and look for all the action verbs and the work characteristic that it goes with. So in Genesis 1:1, God created, which shows authority. And then verse 3, he separated, showing organization, and spoke, which shows communication and authority. And then in verse 4, he names and calls, which demonstrates order and administration. And then finally, in verse 10, he saw that it was good, meaning that he evaluated and found satisfaction in his work. So it's something that God does, and therefore, from a biblical perspective, work doesn't have to be inherently negative. It's something that God does, so work is good. And so in Genesis 1:26 to 27, we then read, God said, "Let us make mankind in our own image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. This is one of the most beautiful passages of Scripture because it gives us our truest identity. You and I are made in the image of God. And so, since we're made in his image, we're made to do good work, to do amazing, wonderful things. The second Hebrew word for work shows up in Genesis 2, and it holds the idea of purpose. It's also translated as service, worship, and slavery. And so the word's common theme is that one person is doing something for the benefit of the other. And in Genesis 2, this Hebrew word appears twice. We see it in verse 5, which says, "There was no one to work the ground." And later in verse 15, God put man in the garden to work and take care of it. So work is clearly something given to humanity by God as part of his good creation plan. It's actually a gift for us and to us. I'm not sure many people in our world would agree with that statement, but as Christ followers, it's part of our DNA. So, how do we show up for work each day and reflect and honor God? Well, we do it with excellence. We give ourselves wholeheartedly to it and do our very best. And yes, because of the fall, work can be toilsome, frustrating, and exhausting, but we don't give up. We try to keep the right perspective. And Paul reminds us in Colossians 3 that whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. And doing our work for the Lord helps keep things in perspective. The menial, boring, difficult things that every job has are important, and we need to do them well for his glory. To know how to please God through our work, we can find help from a biblical perspective, and that comes from reading and studying his word. Can you imagine how different our families, communities, and churches would be if we viewed work as good? Can you imagine the joy, gratitude, and persistence we might see? If we have a biblical perspective on work, this is exactly what can happen. So my challenge to you today is to let it start with you. Check your heart and make sure your perspective on work is a biblical one.